Maggie felt something tighten in her chest. This wasn't just a stray. This kitten had been through something lost, abandoned, or worse. As she cradled the trembling bundle against her chest, the kitten let out the softest sigh. A tiny paw peeked from the folds of the scarf, twitching weakly. "We'll get you warm," she whispered. "I promise." But just as she turned to leave the alley, a strange sensation prickled at the back of her neck. Something about this didn't feel right. Chapter 1. A stranger in the rain. The rain was relentless, drumming against the pavement like 1,000 impatient fingers. The streets of New York shimmered under the glow of flickering streetlights, their reflections distorted by endless ripples and puddles. Muffled car horns and the distant hum of the subway rumbled beneath the city's heartbeat, but none of it mattered to Maggie Holloway at that moment. She pulled her coat tighter around herself as she hurried home, her umbrella struggling against the wind. It had been a long day at the newspaper office, too many deadlines, too many coffee cups left half empty on her desk. The only thing on her mind was a hot shower, a warm blanket, and perhaps an old movie playing in the background while she drifted off to sleep. But then she heard it. A faint, desperate cry, barely audible over the rain and the city noise. Maggie froze, her breath catching. She turned her head, trying to pinpoint the sound. It wasn't the distant wail of a siren, nor the screech of brakes from a cabbie speeding through a red light. No, this was softer frail, high-pitched, and heartbreakingly insistent. A kitten. Her eyes swept the street, but the dim lighting made it difficult to see anything through the curtain of rain. Another cry came, this time more urgent. Maggie took a hesitant step toward the sound. Then another. She found herself in front of a narrow alleyway between two old brick buildings. It smelled of damp concrete and forgotten things. She hesitated. The city had its share of dangers, and she knew better than to wander into dark alleys alone. But then, meow? Asterisk. It was so small, so helpless. Cursing under her breath, Maggie adjusted her bag strap and took a cautious step into the alley. Her boots splashed into a shallow puddle as she moved deeper into the darkness. Then she saw it. A tiny, trembling form huddled against the wall near a stack of broken wooden pallets. The kitten was barely larger than Maggie's hand, its fur a mix of white and ginger, now soaked and plastered against its fragile frame. Its ears were too large for its tiny head, and its eyes huge, round, and frightened reflected the dim glow of the streetlight at the alley's entrance. It looked at her, and let out another pitiful meow, as if begging for help but too weak to move. Maggie's heart clenched. She crouched down slowly, extending a cautious hand. "Hey there, little one," she murmured, keeping her voice soft. "It's okay. I won't hurt you." The kitten flinched but didn't run. It was too exhausted, too cold. Up close, Maggie could see its tiny ribs beneath its wet fur, its whiskers trembling with every shaky breath. She took off her scarf and carefully reached forward. The kitten recoiled slightly but didn't fight as she wrapped it in the soft fabric. The moment she lifted it, the tiny body pressed instinctively against the warmth of her hands, as if surrendering to the safety it had long been denied. Maggie felt something tighten in her chest. This wasn't just a stray. This kitten had been through something lost, abandoned, or worse. As she cradled the trembling bundle against her chest, the kitten let out the softest sigh. A tiny paw peeked from the folds of the scarf, twitching weakly. "We'll get you warm," she whispered. "I promise." But just as she turned to leave the alley, a strange sensation prickled at the back of her neck. Something about this didn't feel right. This kid alone, freezing, on the brink of collapse, hadn't just wandered here by accident. And as Maggie looked down at the small creature, she realized something odd. Around its tiny neck, hidden beneath the damp fur, was a collar, and attached to it, gleaming under the dim light, was a small silver pendant. Chapter 2. A Fight for Survival. The storm hadn't eased as Maggie stepped back onto the sidewalk, the tiny bundle pressed tightly against her chest. The kitten was so light, too light. It barely weighed anything, as if it were made of fragile bones and damp fur alone. Every now and then, she felt a faint tremor run through its tiny body, a sign of exhaustion, or perhaps something worse. "Hold on, little one," she murmured, tightening her grip on the scarf-wrapped kitten. We'll get you warm soon. She quickened her pace toward her apartment, ignoring the way the rain splattered against her jeans and the biting wind that snuck into the gaps of her coat. The kitten hadn't made a sound since she'd picked it up. That silence unnerved her. As she reached her building and fumbled with the keys, a soft, weak vibration buzzed against her hand. The kitten was purring barely, but it was there. The sound was feeble, as if even the act of purring took too much energy, but it was a response, a tiny plea for safety. Maggie's heart clenched. She hurried inside, closing the door behind her with a relieved sigh. The warmth of her apartment was a stark contrast to the cold rain outside. The kitten, still wrapped in her scarf, stirred slightly in her arms. All right, sweetheart, let's get you dry. She carried the kitten into the bathroom, flicking on the heater before kneeling on the tiled floor. Carefully, she unwrapped the scarf, revealing the tiny creature's full form. Now that she could see it properly, the reality was even more heartbreaking. The kitten's fur was matted and soaked, clumping in uneven patches. Its thin frame was evident, little ribs visible beneath the damp fluff. Its ears twitched as if trying to track sounds, but its eyelids drooped, heavy with exhaustion. Maggie reached for a soft towel and gently dabbed at the wet fur. The kitten let out a weak mewl, barely more than a whisper, but it didn't resist. "You're just a little fighter, aren't you?" she murmured, carefully rubbing warmth back into the tiny body. The kitten's fur was a mix of white and ginger. But as Maggie continued drying, she noticed distinct tabby stripes along its forehead and tail. Its paws, impossibly small, twitched as if in some half-dream state. And then there was the collar. Maggie's fingers traced the small, damp strap around the kitten's neck. It was thin but sturdy, a sign that this wasn't just some stray born on the streets. Someone had once cared for this kitten. Her fingers found the small pendant she'd glimpsed earlier. It was round, silver, and smooth to the touch. Carefully, she turned it over, searching for an engraving. There, etched into the metal in tiny, delicate letters, L.A. Maggie frowned. Initials? A name? The kitten didn't look more than a few months old. Had it been lost? Abandoned? She sighed, placing the pendant aside for now. First things first, the kitten needed warmth and food. She finished drying its fur as best she could, then wrapped it in a fresh towel. The kitten still wasn't moving much. Its breathing was steady but shallow, and its head rested limply against the fabric. "You need something to eat, don't you?" Maggie whispered. "Hang on, baby. I'll get you something." She carried the kitten into the kitchen, setting it down carefully in a soft nest of towels on the counter. Her mind raced. She didn't have cat food, why would she? The best she could do was warm milk, but she vaguely remembered reading somewhere that regular milk wasn't good for cats. Water first. Food second. She filled a small dish with lukewarm water and brought it to the kitten. Carefully, she dipped her finger into the water and touched it to the kitten's lips. For a moment, there was no reaction. Then, a tiny pink tongue flicked out. Maggie let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Encouraged, she dipped her finger again and held it near the kitten's mouth. This time, the kitten licked at it a little longer. "That's it. Good baby." She continued this until the kitten had taken a few weak laps from the dish on its own. It was something. As she set the dish aside, her phone buzzed on the counter. She hesitated before picking it up, glancing at the screen. A text from her best friend, Nina. "Nina, you home yet? This rain is insane." Maggie, "Yeah, just got in." She stared at the screen for a moment, debating whether to say more. Finally, she typed, "Maggie, found a kitten." The response came almost immediately. "Nina, what? Nina, are you keeping it?" Maggie glanced at the tiny bundle on her counter. The kitten was curled up in the towel, eyes barely open, breathing slow and steady. Keeping it? She hadn't even thought that far ahead. Right now, she just wanted to make sure it survived the night. "Maggie, I don't know. It has a collar. Might belong to someone." There was a pause before Nina's next message. "Nina, careful, Mags. You're already attached." Maggie swallowed. She looked back at the kitten. It was so small, so fragile. The thought of putting it back on the streets was unthinkable. "I'll figure it out," she murmured, more to herself than to Nina. The kitten stirred slightly in its towel cocoon, one tiny paw twitching. Maggie smiled softly. Whatever happened next, she wasn't letting this little one go just yet. Chapter 3. A Battle for Life. The apartment was quiet except for the steady ticking of the kitchen clock and the faint hum of the heater. Outside, the storm still raged, wind rattling against the window panes. But inside, all of Maggie's attention was fixed on the tiny life curled up in a bundle of towels on her kitchen counter. The kitten had stopped shivering, but it was still frighteningly still. Every few seconds, Maggie reached out to gently brush a fingertip along its tiny back, just to reassure herself that it was still breathing. "You're okay, little one," she whispered, even though she wasn't sure if that was true. She needed food, real food. The kitten had taken a little water, but it was clear that wasn't enough. It was so weak its eyelids fluttered every time she touched it, but it didn't have the strength to fully open them. Her heart pounded as she grabbed her phone and searched, "What can I feed a starving kitten?" Asterisk. Her fingers flew over the screen as she skimmed article after article. Kittens this young needed special kitten formula, not regular milk. Cow's milk could make them sick. And in emergencies, warmed, unseasoned chicken broth or even diluted egg yolk could work temporarily. She had eggs. Maggie rushed to the fridge, grabbed an egg, and cracked it carefully into a bowl. She separated the yolk, then added warm water, whisking until the mixture was smooth. "Okay, baby," she murmured, carefully dipping the tip of her pinky into the liquid. She held it near the kitten's nose. "Nothing." Maggie frowned. The kitten's tiny chest was still rising and falling, but it was barely responsive. Panic twisted in her gut. "Come on, sweetheart, just a little." She dipped her finger again and gently touched the kitten's lips. After a moment, the smallest flicker of a pink tongue appeared, barely brushing against her fingertip. Maggie's breath caught. "That's it," she whispered, encouraging. "Come on, just a little more." She kept at it, dipping her finger, coaxing, whispering soft reassurances. Each time, the kitten licked a little more. Slowly, painstakingly, Maggie worked until the kitten had swallowed several tiny drops. It wasn't much. Nowhere near enough. But it was something. Maggie slumped back in relief, running a hand through her damp hair. The kitten's eyes remained closed, but its breathing had steadied. She needed to do more. Her phone buzzed again, another message from Nina. "Nina, you seriously rescued a kitten in the middle of a storm. That's the most you thing ever." Maggie exhaled a soft laugh, shaking her head. "Maggie, it's barely moving. I don't know if it's going to make it." A pause. Then, "Nina, vet, now." Maggie bit her lip. She knew Nina was right, but it was past midnight. The regular clinics were closed. That meant an emergency vet, and she had no idea where the nearest one was. She did a quick search and found one across town. A 24-hour clinic. Her stomach twisted. That was at least a 20-minute drive, and she didn't have a car. Cabs were unpredictable this late at night, especially in a storm. She glanced back at the kitten. Would it even survive the trip? She hesitated, torn between her options, then took a deep breath. "No choice," she murmured. Gently, she wrapped the kitten in a fresh towel, tucking it close to her chest. She grabbed her keys, shoved her feet into the nearest pair of boots, and threw on her coat. The moment she stepped outside, the cold hit her like a slap. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle, but the wind was brutal. Maggie tightened her grip on the kitten, shielding it as best she could. The streets were emptier now, taxis less frequent. She raised a hand, waving frantically at the first set of headlights she saw. The cab slowed. Maggie jumped in before the driver could ask questions. 24-hour veterinary clinic on 14th, she said quickly. The driver eyed her suspiciously. "You got a pet emergency?" Maggie barely looked up from the bundle in her arms. "Yeah." The man nodded and pulled away from the curb. The ride felt endless. Every few minutes, Maggie checked the kitten, whispering reassurances, but it remained frighteningly limp. "Please," she thought. "Please, don't die." When they finally arrived, she threw cash at the driver without counting and rushed inside. The clinic was quiet, except for the receptionist at the front desk, who looked up, startled. "My kitten's weak. Not eating, please. I just found him." The woman's expression softened. I'll get the vet. Hold on. Maggie paced the waiting area as a young vet tech appeared and gently took the kitten from her arms. We'll take him in right away. Have you noticed any injuries? I don't know, Maggie admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. He was just lying there, freezing. He's not moving much. He has a collar, but I don't know who he belongs to. The tech nodded, already moving toward the exam room. We'll check everything. Just wait here. Maggie sank into one of the plastic chairs, her fingers trembling. She had done everything she could. Now all she could do was wait. Minutes stretched endlessly. She could hear faint voices from the backwards she couldn't make out. She tapped her foot, gnawed at her lip, checked her phone, then checked it again. Finally, the vet emerged. A tall woman in scrubs, wiping her hands on a towel. Her expression was calm but serious. Maggie stood immediately. Is he? He's alive, the vet reassured her. But he's severely underweight and dehydrated. If you hadn't brought him in tonight, he might not have made it until morning. Maggie's stomach twisted. She had almost waited. But with fluids, warmth, and proper nutrition, I think he has a good chance, the vet continued. Relief flooded through Maggie so fast her knees almost buckled. Oh, thank God. The vet offered a small smile. He's a fighter. Maggie exhaled shakily. Yeah, he really is. Would you like to see him? Maggie nodded eagerly. The vet led her back into a small room. The kitten lay curled in a soft blanket inside a heated enclosure, a tiny four taped to one paw. His eyes were half open now, sluggish but alert. He looked at her. Maggie's breath caught. Something inside her shifted in that moment. This wasn't just some stray she had saved. This kitten was hers, and she wasn't letting him go. Chapter 4. A Name and a Promise. The small examination room smelled faintly of antiseptic and clean linen. The quiet hum of a nearby monitor was the only sound aside from Maggie's own heartbeat pounding in her ears. The kitten lay curled in a soft fleece blanket inside a glass-walled incubator, its tiny body rising and falling with slow, measured breaths. A delicate IV line was taped to one impossibly small paw, delivering life-saving fluids drop by drop. His fur, mostly white with scattered ginger patches, looked fluffier now that it was dry, though he was still heartbreakingly thin. Maggie pressed her fingers against the glass, swallowing past the tightness in her throat. Hey, little one, she whispered. The kitten didn't move at first. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he stirred. A tiny paw flexed. His whiskers twitched. Slowly, so very slowly, his eyes opened just a fraction, revealing hazy pools of pale green. Maggie exhaled sharply, relief washing over her like a wave. The vet, Dr. Larson, stood beside her, watching the kitten with a thoughtful expression. He's responding well to the fluids. His temperature is stabilizing, but he's still very weak. Maggie nodded, barely tearing her gaze away. But he's going to be okay, right? Dr. Larson hesitated just a moment too long. We're cautiously optimistic, she said gently. But he's severely malnourished, and his body has been through a lot. The next 24 hours are crucial. He needs warmth, nourishment, and rest. Maggie's fingers curled into fists at her sides. Asterisk 24 hours. Asterisk, she could handle that. He'll need round the clock care, Dr. Larson continued. We can keep him here for monitoring, or if you're willing, you can take him home and care for him yourself. Maggie blinked, caught off guard. I can take him home? Dr. Larson smiled faintly. With the right supplies, I can give you formula, syringes for feeding, and a heating pad. He'll need small, frequent feedings every few hours, even through the night. It's a big commitment. Maggie didn't hesitate. I'll do it. The words left her mouth before she could even think about them. But she didn't regret them for a second. Dr. Larson gave her a knowing look. Are you sure? This is a fragile kitten, and the care he needs isn't easy. Maggie looked at the kitten again. He was so tiny, so helpless. And yet, against all odds, he had survived. He had fought. She couldn't walk away now. I'm sure, she said firmly. He's coming home with me. The first night, the cab ride home was slower than Maggie would have liked, but she kept the kitten tucked safely inside a soft carrier, the heating pad warming the inside. She could hear his tiny breaths, feel the faint rise and fall of his chest. The responsibility weighed heavily on her. She had no experience caring for such a fragile creature, but she refused to fail him. When they arrived at her apartment, she immediately set up a small, warm nest in a box lined with fleece blankets. She placed the heating pad underneath one side, just as Dr. Larson had instructed, so the kitten could move to a cooler area if he needed to. She carefully unzipped the carrier and lifted him out, mindful of his delicate frame. He barely stirred as she placed him into the blankets, his tiny body curling instinctively against the warmth. Maggie sat cross-legged on the floor beside him, watching every tiny movement, every flutter of his whiskers. "Okay, baby," she murmured. "Time to eat." She prepped the kitten formula, warming it slightly, then drew a small amount into the syringe. With the utmost care, she placed the tip near his mouth. At first, he didn't respond. Maggie's heart pounded. She gently touched a drop of milk to his lips. Nothing. Her pulse quickened. She tried again, rubbing a fingertip along his cheek, mimicking the way a mother cat would encourage her kittens. Finally, latched onto the syringe, weak but determined, and swallowed. Maggie nearly cried in relief. "That's it, sweetheart. Good boy." She continued feeding him in slow, measured drops, pausing often to let him rest. He only took a few milliliters before his tiny body sagged against the blanket, exhausted. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. Maggie wiped his face gently with a warm cloth before tucking him back into the blankets. His tiny paws twitched, and for the first time, she heard a faint, breathy purr. Something deep inside her cracked open. She had never expected to feel this attached, this protective. But now, looking at the tiny, helpless creature curled up in her apartment, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would do whatever it took to keep him safe. A name for a fighter. Morning arrived far too quickly. Maggie had woken every 2 hours to feed him, setting alarms, sitting groggily on the floor as she coaxed him to drink. It was exhausting, but she didn't care. By sunrise, she was sipping her second cup of coffee, eyes bleary but heart light. The kitten had survived the night. She sat beside his makeshift bed, watching as he shifted slightly in his sleep. His fur was still patchy and thin, but his breathing was stronger, more even. He was getting better. "You need a name," Maggie murmured. She thought back to the silver pendant on his tiny collar, the one with the initials LA*. It might have meant something before, but now he was hers. A fighter. A survivor. "Lucky," she said softly. "How about that?" As if in response, the kitten let out a tiny sigh and curled deeper into the blanket. Maggie smiled. "Lucky it is." Chapter 5. A bond forged in fragility. Maggie hadn't meant to get attached so quickly, but as she sat cross-legged on the floor, watching Lucky's tiny chest rise and fall, she realized it had already happened. The kitten was still so heartbreakingly small, his fur soft but patchy, his paws impossibly delicate. Every few minutes, he twitched in his sleep, tiny whiskers trembling as if caught in some silent dream. He had survived the night, but Maggie knew better than to relax. He was far from safe. She gently stroked a fingertip over his head. His ears twitched, but he didn't wake. "You're a fighter, Lucky," she whispered. The name had come to her in a half-dazed, sleep-deprived moment, but it felt right. He was Lucky. He had survived the freezing rain, the hunger, the loneliness. And now, he had her, and she had him. A fragile routine. Caring for Lucky became Maggie's entire world. She set alarms every 2 hours to feed him, just as Dr. Larson had instructed. At first, the feedings were nerve-wracking. Lucky was still so weak that he barely responded when she nudged the syringe to his lips. But Maggie was patient. She warmed the formula carefully, tested the temperature on her wrist, and coaxed him into drinking tiny, precious drops. Each time he took even the smallest amount, she praised him softly. "Good boy, Lucky," she murmured. "Just a little more, sweetheart." By the third day, he was drinking with slightly more enthusiasm, though he tired quickly. Maggie kept a close eye on him, tracking every change. Was he moving more? Was he stronger? His weight was still frighteningly low, but the purring, it was faint at first, barely more than a whisper, but by the second night, it was undeniable. Lucky purred when she touched him. It was a tiny, fragile sound, but it made Maggie's heart clench. He trusted her. It was a kind of responsibility she had never felt before. A question of the past. Late one evening, as Lucky dozed curled in her lap, Maggie found herself staring at the tiny silver pendant attached to his collar. L.A. asterisk. She had been so focused on keeping him alive that she hadn't thought about what those initials meant. Someone had once cared for this kitten. Someone had put this collar on him. And yet, she had found him alone, freezing to death in the rain. Had he been lost? Or worse, had someone abandoned him? Maggie's stomach twisted at the thought. She traced her fingers over the pendant, considering. Should she try to find his owner? Would it be the right thing to do? The rational part of her said, yes. If he had a home, someone was probably missing him. But the selfish part of her, the part that had spent every waking moment caring for him, couldn't bear the idea of giving him up. Lucky stirred in her lap, letting out a soft mew before settling again. Maggie sighed, brushing her fingers over his tiny back. I'll figure it out, she whispered. But deep down, she was terrified of the answer. Tiny victories. Each day brought small improvements. Lucky's legs, once too weak to support him, grew steadier. He wobbled around her apartment like a newborn fawn, his tiny paws uncoordinated but determined. His appetite improved, and Maggie nearly cried the first time he eagerly latched onto the syringe without coaxing. One afternoon, she found him batting weakly at a stray thread on her blanket. It was barely a move and just, a hesitant, clumsy swipe, but it was the first sign of real kitten-like behavior. Maggie laughed, the sound light and full of relief. You're going to be trouble, aren't you? She teased, scratching the top of his head. Lucky responded by letting out a soft, squeaky meow. Maggie melted. He was coming back to life. A visitor and a warning. A few nights later, Nina showed up unannounced, bursting through Maggie's front door with her usual whirlwind energy. Okay, I need to see this kitten, she announced, tossing her coat onto the couch. Maggie chuckled. Shh, he just ate. He's sleeping. Nina padded over to where Lucky lay, curled in his nest of blankets. Her eyes widened. Oh my God, he's tiny. Maggie nodded. Yeah, but he's getting stronger. Nina crouched down, tilting her head. He's cute. Weirdly, ridiculously cute. But, have you thought about what happens next? Maggie frowned. What do you mean? Nina gave her a knowing look. You do realize you're keeping him, right? Maggie hesitated. I don't know. He had a collar, Nina. He might belong to someone. Nina raised an eyebrow. And do you really want to give him back? Silence. Maggie bit her lip. I don't know, she admitted, barely above a whisper. I don't know if I can. Nina sighed, sitting beside her. Look, I get it. You saved him. You've been up all night feeding him, taking care of him, and now you're obsessed with his every little meow. That's your kitten Mags. Maggie let out a shaky breath. But, Nina continued, more gently this time, if you do, look for his owner. You need to be prepared for what you might find. Maggie swallowed hard. She knew Nina was right. If she started looking, there was a chancino, a likelihood that someone out there would claim him, that someone had lost him and wanted him back. Could she handle that? Her eyes drifted back to Lucky, his tiny body rising and falling in sleep. Could she handle losing him? She didn't have an answer. All she knew was that she wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. Chapter 6. A Heart Divided. Maggie lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft rhythm of Lucky's breathing. The little kitten was curled against her chest, nestled into the folds of her hoodie, where he had dozed off after his last feeding. His tiny paws occasionally flexed in sleep, his warm, fragile body rising and falling with each slow breath. Maggie had been sleeping with him this way for the past few nights. At first, she had been afraid, terrified that he was still too weak, too fragile. But Lucky had refused to settle anywhere else. The moment she placed him in his fleece-lined box, he would let out the tiniest, most pitiful cry until she scooped him up again. Now, She couldn't imagine sleeping without the warmth of his little body curled against her. But Nina's words from earlier kept echoing in her head. If you look for his owner, you need to be prepared for what you might find. Maggie gently stroked the soft fur between Lucky's ears, feeling the weight of those words settle deeper into her chest. Was she really willing to risk losing him? She had spent days nursing him back to health, had given up sleep, canceled plans, and reorganized her entire life around his tiny, fragile existence. She had become his person, but what if he already had a person? What if someone out there was missing him just as desperately as she had fought to save him? The rational part of her knew what she should do. She should check for lost pet listings. She should take him to a vet to see if he had a microchip. She should at least try to find out where he had come from. But the emotional part of her, the part that had cradled his weak little body, whispered encouragements into his fur, and cried in relief every time he took another sip of formula couldn't bear the thought of losing him. Maggie squeezed her eyes shut. Tomorrow, she told herself. Asterisk, I'll figure it out tomorrow. But deep down, she wasn't sure if she really would. Signs of life. The next morning, Maggie woke to the sensation of tiny paws kneading against her neck. She groggily opened one eye to find Lucky perched on her shoulder, wide awake and stretching his tiny limbs with newfound energy. His ears, once folded slightly from malnutrition, now stood up properly. His eyes, though still a little sleepy, were more alert than they had ever been. Well, asterisk. Someone's asterisk feeling better, Maggie murmured, her voice thick with sleep. Lucky responded with an excited little chirp, then immediately lost his balance and tumbled down onto her chest. Maggie caught him with both hands, laughing. Okay, easy there, Tiger. One step at a time. She sat up, rubbing the sleep from her eyes, and watched as Lucky attempted to climb over the blankets, his tiny tail flicking with determination. He was still a bit wobbly, but his movements were stronger. It was the first time he had shown any real interest in exploring. Maggie's heart swelled. He was growing, getting stronger. And yet, that only made her more anxious. The stronger he got, the closer she was to having to make a decision, and she wasn't ready. The collar and the choice. Maggie spent the rest of the day researching lost pet listings online, scrolling through pages of missing cat posts, searching for anything that matched Lucky's description. Nothing. No white and ginger kittens with silver collars. No posts mentioning the initials LA**. She should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt uneasy. Finally, with a deep breath, she grabbed her phone and dialed Dr. Larson's clinic. A cheerful receptionist answered, Cedarvale Animal Hospital. How can I help you? Hi, this is Maggie Carter. I brought in a kitten a few days ago, Lucky. I was wondering if I could come by and have him checked for a microchip? Of course. We can fit you in this afternoon if that works for you. Maggie hesitated. She had just committed to this decision, and yet now that it was actually happening, she felt a wave of resistance. But she forced herself to say, Yeah, that works. Thank you. As soon as she hung up, she looked down at Lucky, who was busy wrestling with the corner of a blanket, completely unaware that his entire future might be decided today. Maggie exhaled shakily. Guess we're doing this, buddy. The scan. The ride to the vet was quiet. Lucky had curled up inside his carrier, pressing his tiny nose against the mesh window. Maggie kept one hand on the side, rubbing gently, as if reassuring both him and herself. When they arrived, Dr. Larson greeted them with a warm smile. Well, well, look who's looking stronger. Maggie managed a small smile. Yeah, he's been eating better, moving more. He even tried to play this morning. That's a great sign, Dr. Larson said as she reached for the scanner. All right, let's see if we find anything. Maggie held her breath as the vet gently ran the microchip scanner along Lucky's tiny body. One pass. Another. Nothing. Dr. Larson tried again, adjusting the angle. The machine remained silent. Maggie slowly exhaled. He's not chipped, Dr. Larson confirmed. If he had an owner, they didn't register him. Maggie's chest tightened. So, that means he's just a stray? Not necessarily, Dr. Larson said gently. He could have had an owner. Maybe someone who didn't think to chip him. Maybe he got lost. Maybe he was abandoned. The last word sent a cold shiver down Maggie's spine. She looked down at Lucky, now curled contentedly in her lap. Abandoned. The thought made her stomach turn. Had someone really just left him? A kitten this tiny, this helpless? Maggie swallowed hard. Dr. Larson's voice softened. If you want to keep looking for his owner, you can post online, check shelters, put up flyers. But if no one comes forward? Maggie glanced up. The vet smiled. You've already done so much for him. I don't think he could have found a better home. Maggie's heart pounded. Yeah, she murmured, stroking Lucky's soft fur. Me neither. A silent decision. Maggie walked home that afternoon, with Lucky nestled against her chest in his carrier. She could keep looking. She should keep looking. But the more she thought about it, the more certain she became. No one had come looking for him. No one had chipped him, left any posters, or even seemed to notice he was missing. But she had found him. She had rescued him from the cold, fed him, kept him warm, woken up every 2 hours to make sure he survived. She was the one who had held him, whispered encouragements into his fur, and cried in relief when he purred for the first time. She had already made her choice. Lucky was hers, and she wasn't letting him go. Chapter 7. A home for Lucky. Maggie had made her decision, as she sat cross-legged on the floor of her apartment, watching Lucky bat clumsily at the end of a shoelace. She felt an overwhelming sense of peace. He was hers. The weight of uncertainty that had been pressing on her chest for days was gone. No more scrolling through lost pet listings. No more wondering if someone would come forward. If Lucky had belonged to someone before, they weren't looking for him now. He had been alone, hungry, and freezing to death until she found him. She wasn't just his rescuer. She was his person. Lucky let out a tiny, determined growl as he pounced on the shoelace, missing entirely and tumbling onto his side. Maggie laughed, scooping him up and pressing a soft kiss to the top of his head. You're stuck with me now, little guy. Lucky, in response, let out a happy, squeaky meow. And that was that. Settling in. Now that Maggie knew Lucky was hers to keep, everything changed. She no longer felt hesitant about rearranging her life for him now. She wanted to. The first order of business, officially making her apartment kitten-friendly. She went on a shopping spree, returning home with bags filled with supplies. A soft, plush bed, even though she knew he'd probably still sleep on her chest. A variety of kitten-safe toys, a proper litter box, and, of course, a small bag of high-quality kitten food for when he was ready to transition from formula. Setting everything up felt surreal. Just a week ago, she hadn't even thought about owning a pet. Now, her apartment was slowly transforming into a home for a tiny, mischievous kitten. Lucky, meanwhile, was delighted by every new addition. The crinkly toy mouse? Instant fascination. The soft bed? A cautious sniff, followed by a skeptical look, then complete disinterest in favor of curling up in Maggie's lap. The litter box? Mild confusion, then quick understanding after some gentle guidance. Maggie was amazed at how quickly he adapted. It was like he knew he was home. A name that sticks. The first time Maggie had called him Lucky, she hadn't thought much of it. It had just slipped out in a half-dazed moment of relief. But now, it felt right. You know, you really are lucky, she mused one evening, as she lay on the couch, Lucky curled up on her stomach. You almost didn't make it, Lucky purred softly, stretching out one tiny paw before settling deeper into her sweater. Maggie smiled. Then again, she murmured, scratching under his chin. Maybe I'm the lucky one. She hadn't realized how much she needed him until now. Nina's "I told you so" moment. You adopted him. It wasn't a question. It was a statement delivered with a knowing smirk as Nina stood in Maggie's apartment, arms crossed. Maggie rolled her eyes, holding Lucky against her chest. You act like this is shocking information. Oh, it's not shocking, Nina said, reaching out to scratch Lucky's tiny head. I just wanted to hear you admit it. Maggie sighed. Fine, you were right. I couldn't give him up. I knew it. Nina laughed, plopping down onto the couch. I mean, come on. You've been practically glued to this tiny fluffball since you found him. There was no way you were gonna let him go." Maggie bit back a smile. Yeah. Nina grinned. "So, what's the plan? Full-on crazy cat lady mode? Are you gonna start an Instagram account for him?" Maggie snorted. "Let's get him past the fits in my hand stage first." They both looked down at Lucky, who was currently stretched across Maggie's forearm, blinking up at them sleepily. Nina sighed dramatically. "Fine, but when he grows up and gets famous, I demand credit for predicting it." Maggie laughed. For the first time in days, everything felt right. A tiny, fierce protector. Lucky had been gaining strength every day, but Maggie wasn't prepared for just how much energy he'd suddenly have. One morning, as she was making coffee, she felt something latch onto her ankle. She yelped, nearly spilling her mug, and looked down to see Lucky clinging to her sock with all the fierceness of a lion tackling its prey. Maggie stared. Lucky stared back. Then, with a proud little chirp, he released her foot and scampered off, his tiny tail flicking triumphantly behind him. Maggie exhaled. "Oh, this is what we're doing now, huh?" It turned out Lucky was fearless. Shoelaces? Attacked. Asterisk. Phone charger? Wrestled into submission. Asterisk. Blankets? Ambushed, with a level of determination that should not exist in something so small. Asterisk. Maggie had to start watching her step because Lucky had decided his new favorite game was to hide under furniture and launch surprise attacks on her feet. And of course, the moment she scolded him, he'd look up at her with those wide, innocent eyes completely unbothered by his crimes. Maggie sighed, rubbing her temples. "I have created a monster." Lucky meowed in agreement. A future together. As the weeks passed, Lucky continued to grow stronger. His once scrawny frame started filling out, his fur became softer and shinier, and his clumsy, wobbly movements turned into confident little strides. Maggie couldn't believe how much he had changed. But one thing had stayed the same. He was still her Lucky. Every night, he curled up on her chest, purring softly as he drifted off to sleep. Every morning, he greeted her with excited lips, ready to start the day. Maggie had never planned to have a cat, but now she couldn't imagine life without him. One evening, as she sat on the couch, Lucky stretched out beside her, purring happily, she realized something. She hadn't just saved him. He had saved her too. Chapter 8. Growing Together. The days passed in a blur of kitten-filled moments. Lucky was growing faster than Maggie could keep up with. Each day seemed to bring something new. His playful antics, his curiosity about everything from the shadows in the corners of the room to the mysterious contents of the kitchen cupboards. It was as though each time Maggie turned around, Lucky had discovered a new corner of her life to claim as his own. She'd wake up to find him curled up in her shoes, his tiny form tucked inside as if it were the most comfortable bed in the world. Or she'd open the fridge, only to hear the faintest sound of claws tapping on the tiles, and look down to find him standing there, watching her with wide eyes, as though making sure she didn't forget to feed him. But Maggie's favorite moments were those rare, peaceful stretches of time when Lucky would climb onto her lap, curl into a tight ball, and fall asleep. The rhythm of his tiny, steady breaths became her heartbeat, her own sense of calm amidst the noise of life. She had found a routine one that included more playtime than she had expected, but also more quiet moments than she had imagined. And the thing that surprised her the most was how deeply she had fallen for him. He had, in some ways, become the center of her world. Maggie had never thought she'd become the type of person who would talk about their pet, as if it were a child. But here she was, constantly texting Nina about Lucky's latest developments, his newest tricks, his favorite new spots to nap, the odd little behaviors he'd developed, like hiding behind the curtains and waiting for Maggie to find him. And Nina, for her part, was constantly on the lookout for Lucky's future as a celebrity. She'd been joking about creating an Instagram for him ever since the day Maggie had adopted him, but Maggie hadn't been too sure. However, as Lucky's personality began to shine through, she couldn't help but see the appeal. He was a star in his own right, after all. The first vet visit. It was time for Lucky's first official checkup, and Maggie was both excited and nervous. He had been growing so fast, his energy levels skyrocketing, and his appetite insatiable. She wanted to be sure that everything was going as it should, that he was healthy and thriving. Dr. Larson greeted them with a warm smile, her ever so gentle hands reaching out to scoop Lucky from his carrier. "Well, look who's getting big. How's my little guy doing?" she asked, lifting him up to examine him. Lucky squirmed a little, clearly more interested in the room than in the veterinarian, but he didn't seem too stressed. Maggie felt a small nod of relief. "Seems like he's doing great," Maggie said, watching Dr. Larson feel his stomach, check his ears, and take note of the little kitten's playful squirming. "His weight's on track, doctor," Larson reported. "His coat looks healthy, his heart sounds strong. Overall, he's a thriving kitten." She paused, meeting Maggie's eyes. "You're doing a fantastic job with him." Maggie couldn't help but grin. "Thanks. He's a lot of work, but he's so worth it." Dr. Larson chuckled. "I think he's got a lot of personality for such a small guy, but that's what makes kittens so much fun, isn't it?" Maggie nodded, her heart swelling. Lucky wasn't just a tiny, needy animal to her anymore. He was a source of joy, of laughter, of pure companionship. He had become part of her, and it was hard to remember a time before he was there, padding around her apartment, his tiny mews filling the silence. First, real playtime. Maggie was still in the process of kitten-proofing her apartment. Some parts were easy storing away the shoes, putting away sharp objects, and securing things that were fragile. But it was the little things that always caught her off guard, like how Lucky had started climbing her bookshelves. She'd come home from work one afternoon to find him perched on the highest shelf, looking down at her with an expression of victory. "You little daredevil," Maggie muttered as she carefully climbed up the ladder to retrieve him. Lucky made a soft, pleased meow and batted at a book, clearly entertained by his new vantage point. Maggie chuckled, shaking her head. "Guess we need to move some things around again," she said, gently setting him on the floor. Lucky wasted no time in scurrying to the next part of his territory to conquer the couch cushions. Within minutes, he had somehow managed to crawl into the deep crevices, paws waving around as if he were on a grand adventure. Maggie couldn't help but laugh as she heard his excited mews, trying to wriggle out. She reached down and scooped him up, gently pulling him free. All right. You're clearly a natural explorer." Lucky meowed again, but this time it was more of a soft purr. He was satisfied with his accomplishments. "Okay, mister, you're gonna be the death of me," Maggie teased, and Lucky gave her a very unbothered look as he nestled into her arms. A growing bond. Lucky was no longer just the fragile kitten Maggie had rescued from the street. He was turning into something far more significant, a source of companionship, of laughter, of purpose. It had taken time, but Maggie had come to realize that the decision to keep him had been one of the best she'd ever made. She hadn't been looking for a pet, but somehow Lucky had found her. And, in the process, he had found a place in her heart that she didn't know was empty. Every time she looked down at him, purring contentedly in her lap, or saw him climbing eagerly onto her shoulder to curl up, Maggie felt a rush of gratitude for his presence. She had saved him, but in so many ways, he had saved her right back. Lucky had filled a hole in her life she hadn't even realized existed a need for something that was entirely hers, something that relied on her completely. The days of coming home to an empty apartment had faded into a distant memory, replaced by the joyful chaos of a playful kitten. As she sat on the couch, her legs tucked under her, Lucky snuggled up into the crook of her arm. Maggie felt complete, and for the first time in a long while, she realized just how much she had needed this tiny, mischievous creature. She didn't know what the future held, but for now, it was enough to simply know that they had each other. And that was all she needed. With Lucky curled against her, purring in contentment, Maggie whispered softly, "We're gonna be okay." And in that moment, she believed it wholeheartedly. Chapter 9. Unbreakable Bonds. Maggie woke up to the soft sound of purring and the warm sensation of something snuggled into her chest. It wasn't the usual drowsy morning routine where she slowly became aware of the world around her. No, today felt different. The room was filled with the golden morning light that poured through the window, casting long shadows across the floor. And there, nestled in the curve of her arm, was Lucky. He'd grown so much in such a short time. His once tiny frame had filled out, His fur was thick and soft, and his movements were sure and graceful. Lucky was becoming a true catagile, confident, and endlessly curious. The sight of him curled up on her chest, his eyes fluttering closed as he purred in contentment, filled Maggie's heart with a deep, unspoken joy. She smiled softly, pressing a kiss to his small, warm head. "Good morning, Lucky," she whispered. Lucky stirred slightly, lifting his head to blink up at her. His wide green eyes, the color of fresh spring leaves, stared up at her with such innocence. He gave a soft, almost undetectable meow, then dropped his head back down, settling even deeper into the cozy spot on her chest. His purring became a gentle hum, vibrating through her, reassuring her that everything was right in their world. Maggie's fingers gently stroked the smooth, velvety fur along his back, and for a moment, everything outside of this tiny space her apartment, her responsibilities, the world faded away. It was just her and Lucky, in this cocoon of comfort. Lucky's little adventures. As the weeks passed, Lucky's curiosity grew exponentially. He was no longer the skittish kitten she had found shivering on the street. He had blossomed into a tiny adventurer, his energy boundless, his intelligence sharp. Every day brought new mischief and delightful moments of discovery. Maggie had been working from home more often lately, and Lucky had made it his mission to help her every step of the way. He'd climb onto her desk, bat at the edges of her keyboard, or curl up on top of her papers, ensuring that everything she worked on was thoroughly inspected. Sometimes, he would push pens off the edge of her desk just to watch them roll. Other times, he'd settle into a box she had left out, which was an immediate sign to Maggie that the contents of that box would no longer remain intact. But no matter the chaos, it was hard to get upset when she saw that mischievous glint in his eyes. One afternoon, Maggie watched with mild amusement as Lucky spent nearly 20 minutes trying to catch a stray sunbeam that had slipped through the blinds. He pounced at it, jumped, and scrambled, but the light, of course, was ever elusive. His frustration mounted as he padded in circles, his little tail flicking rapidly behind him. Finally, with a dramatic huff, he flopped down onto the floor, his tiny body deflating like a balloon. He let out an exaggerated sigh and closed his eyes as though to say, "Well, that's that." Asterisk. Maggie burst out laughing, her heart swelling with affection. She couldn't help but marvel at how much life he had brought into her quiet apartment. He had filled every corner, every moment with his playful antics, and yet he always knew how to bring a sense of calm when she needed it most. She leaned over and scooped him up, pressing him gently to her chest. Lucky nuzzled her, his soft fur tickling her neck. He looked up at her with those wide, expressive eyes, and Maggie felt her chest tighten with love. How did I get so lucky? Asterisk. The first storm. It was late one afternoon when the storm hit. The clouds had rolled in fast, dark, and heavy, and Maggie could hear the rumble of thunder in the distance. By the time she closed her laptop and stood up, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows. The sky had grown an unsettling shade of gray, and the first heavy raindrops began to pound against the glass. Lucky, who had been sprawled out on the couch, jumped up in alarm, his eyes wide with surprise. The suddenness of the storm had clearly startled him. He paced back and forth on the floor, his tail puffing up and twitching nervously as he looked from the window to Maggie. His little paws patted rapidly on the floor as he tried to find a place to hide. Maggie's heart softened at his clear distress. She crouched down beside him and gently scooped him up, cradling him against her chest. He immediately buried his head in the crook of her neck, his small body trembling slightly. Maggie felt a pang of sympathy for him, knowing the storm must be frightening with the loud thunder and the gusts of wind rattling the windows. "It's okay, Lucky," Maggie murmured, rubbing his back soothingly. "It's just a storm. It'll be over soon." But Lucky wasn't so sure. He clung to her tighter, his little body tense. Maggie sat down on the couch, holding him close as the storm raged outside. As the thunder boomed louder and the wind howled against the building, Maggie found herself holding Lucky even tighter, as though by doing so she could shield him from the scary noises and flashes of lightning. For the next half hour, they sat like that, the two of them together in the middle of the storm. Slowly, Lucky began to relax, his trembling subsiding as he adjusted to the rhythm of Maggie's gentle breathing. Eventually, his little body gave a soft, contented sigh, and his eyes fluttered closed. As the storm continued its furious symphony outside, Maggie held him close, grateful for the quiet comfort they found in each other's presence. It was moments like these when Lucky sought her out for protection, trusting her completely that Maggie realized how much their bond had deepened. They were no longer just two beings living in the same space. They were a team. Lucky had become her family, her companion in the truest sense of the word. And Maggie knew, in that moment, that no matter what storms life brought, whether they were literal or metaphorical, she would always have him by her side. New discoveries. As Lucky's health continued to improve, so did his exploration of the world around him. Maggie began to notice subtle changes in his behavior. He was more independent now, spending time in other rooms of the apartment, curling up in the sun by the window, or chasing shadows along the hallway. His sense of curiosity had always been his defining trait, but now it was taking on new forms. One afternoon, while Maggie was in the kitchen, Lucky wandered over to the back door, his little paws tapping softly against the floor. He looked up at her, his eyes wide and full of intrigue. "You want to go outside, huh?" Maggie asked, raising an eyebrow. She wasn't sure if she was ready to take that step yet. The world outside her apartment felt so big, and Lucky was still so small, so vulnerable. But there was something about the way he looked at her, the soft, insistent mew that escaped his lips, that made her reconsider. Maggie opened the door just enough to let him peer outside. She kept a firm hold on the frame, her hand ready to pull him back if anything seemed off. Lucky immediately took a few cautious steps toward the threshold, his tail flicking in excitement. "Just a little bit," she said, her voice soft but firm. "We'll start slow." Lucky darted outside with a burst of energy, his small paws hitting the pavement with rapid taps. Maggie followed him carefully, watching as he sniffed at the air, investigating the new scents that surrounded him. It was a small step, but it was the beginning of a new chapter for them both. Lucky was becoming a brave, adventurous kitten, ready to face the world beyond her apartment. And Maggie, as she stood in the doorway, watching him with a protective but encouraging smile, knew that whatever the future held for them, they would face it together. Chapter 10. Uncharted Territory. The mornings had become a peaceful routine. Maggie woke up to the soft sound of Lucky's purring, his little body nestled against her, still warm from sleep. It had become something of a ritual now, the way she'd stretch her arms, slowly wake up, and then reach for the tiny, fluffy form lying beside her. Lucky, who had grown into a more confident kitten, would stir at the same time every day, shifting closer to her, nuzzling her for comfort. It was a beautiful way to start the day, and Maggie cherished the simple connection they shared. It felt like the calm before the storm of responsibilities that always seemed to pile up. Work, errands, life, these things had a way of catching up with her. But with Lucky by her side, she felt like she could weather anything. But that morning, things felt different. The storm had passed the night before, leaving a lingering chill in the air. The sun, while bright, was muted, casting long shadows through the apartment. As Maggie reached for Lucky, she noticed something unsettling. He wasn't nestled up against her like he usually was. Instead, he was sitting at the edge of the bed, staring out the window, his back slightly arched, his fur standing up just a little. There was something tense about his posture, as though he sensed something she didn't. Maggie's heart skipped a beat. She followed his gaze. Out the window, she could see the branches of the large oak tree swaying gently in the wind. The world beyond her apartment was calm. But Lucky, in that moment, looked anything but. He shifted uneasily, his little tail twitching. "Hey, what's going on, buddy?" she whispered, sitting up slowly. She reached for him, but he darted away from her touch, his eyes wide with uncertainty. It wasn't like him. He was always so affectionate, so ready to snuggle and seek her out for attention. But today, there was a wariness in his eyes that unsettled Maggie. She stood up and approached him carefully, trying not to startle him. "Lucky," she said softly, "what's wrong?" He turned to look at her, his eyes briefly locking onto hers before darting back to the window. A soft growl rumbled deep in his chest, a sound she hadn't heard from him before. Maggie froze. This was no ordinary kitten growl. It was deep, guttural, a protective sound. Her breath caught in her throat. Was there something outside? Something that had frightened him? Maggie walked cautiously to the window, her heart pounding in her chest. She parted the blinds slightly, peering out, her eyes scanning the yard. Nothing. The street was quiet, the trees still swaying, and the birds were chirping as usual. But Lucky wasn't backing down. He stayed rooted to the spot, staring intently out the window, his fur still bristling. Suddenly, there was a sharp scratch at the door. Maggie's heart skipped a beat, and she spun around to face it. It wasn't the usual noise from outside, like the wind or the occasional creak of the building. It was distinct. It was deliberate. Her instincts told her to be cautious, but she couldn't ignore the curiosity building inside her. She crossed the room slowly, Lucky's eyes never leaving her. As she reached for the doorknob, the scratching continued persistent, rhythmic, and almost unnerving. Maggie hesitated for a moment, her hand resting on the door. Then, with a deep breath, she opened it. The hallway outside was empty. Nothing was there except the quiet hum of the building settling around her. But as she looked down at the floor, she noticed something strange as small, almost imperceptible trail of dirt leading into her apartment, as though something had crawled along the floor. Lucky's growl turned into a hiss, a low, almost predatory sound, and he bolted past Maggie, heading straight for the door. Maggie quickly closed it behind him, but the moment of hesitation had been enough to make her heart race. She couldn't quite place it, but something was off. "Lucky," she whispered, kneeling down to his level. His eyes were wild now, wide and alert, his body poised as if preparing to leap into action. His tail flicked rapidly, his ears back. He was on edge, and whatever he was sensing, she had to admit, was making her feel uneasy too. Maggie looked down at the floor again. The trail of dirt seemed to have ended at the threshold of her living room. But what bothered her wasn't the dirt, it was the strange feeling that washed over her, an instinct that told her she was not alone in her own home. Something had crossed into her space, and Lucky had recognized it long before she had. She reached out to touch him, but he leapt back suddenly, a startled mule escaping him. "It's okay, Lucky," she said gently, though the word felt hollow in her mouth. "What's going on?" The tension in the room thickened, and Maggie's mind raced. What had happened last night? She replayed the storm in her head. Had she heard anything unusual? No, she couldn't remember. Lucky finally calmed down slightly, but his eyes still darted around the room, his gaze locking onto the corners, the cracks in the walls, as though he could sense something hidden just out of view. Maggie's heart pounded in her chest. She needed answers. She grabbed her phone from the side table and quickly sent a message to Nina. "Maggie, hey, something weird is going on here. Lucky's acting strange, he's really on edge, like something's wrong. Did you hear anything unusual last night? Any reason he might be acting like this?" It only took a few moments for Nina to respond. Nina, _ "That's weird. I didn't hear anything. Maybe he just got spooked by the storm? You know how sensitive cats can be with noises? _ Maggie shook her head, reading Nina's reply. No, this wasn't just about the storm. Lucky had always been nervous during loud noises, but this felt different. Suddenly, there was another noisy, faint scratching again. But this time, it came from the kitchen. Maggie's heart skipped again. She wasn't imagining it. She could hear it clearly now. The sound of something scraping against the floor. Her instincts screamed at her to stay still, to not investigate. But Lucky's reaction was more telling than any of her own fears. Without a moment's hesitation, he dashed toward the kitchen, his body low to the ground, his claws unsheathed. Maggie stood frozen for a second, fear gripping her. But the fear didn't last long. She took a deep breath, steadied herself, and followed. The kitchen was empty, at least. It seemed empty. But as she stepped inside, Maggie felt it again. That strange, unshakable feeling that something was off. Her eyes darted around the room, looking for anything out of place. And that's when she saw it. A small open window on the far side of the room. A breeze was coming through, rustling the curtains. The scratch marks she had heard earlier, the ones that had sent Lucky into a frenzy, had come from this direction. But there was no sign of an intruder. No broken glass. Nothing that could explain what had set Lucky off. Maggie exhaled sharply, her mind racing. Something wasn't right. Something had crossed into her life and was now hiding in the shadows, and it had scared Lucky enough to make him react in a way she'd never seen before. What was it? And more importantly, why was it here? She looked down at Lucky, still tense, his eyes focused on the kitchen counter, where the shadows seemed to twist. Whatever it wasn't over yet, and they had just entered uncharted territory. And so, with Lucky at her side, Maggie braced herself for what was about to come.